Welcome to Brother Miller's Notes. As we look together at Joseph Smith history, chapter 1, verses 1 through 26, we're really going to focus on Joseph Smith's first vision. But starting off, who was Joseph Smith? And maybe more specifically, how do you think Joseph Smith saw himself as a teenager? Because a lot of times when we think of Joseph Smith, we think of a mature leader, a prophet, a spokesman of God. It is very interesting to see the words that Joseph uses as he describes himself as a teenager. As a teenager, he talks about having all my anxieties. And that's something that a lot of teenagers can relate to. Maybe being a little anxious. They have anxieties. He describes himself as an obscure boy, a boy of no consequence in the world. He sees himself maybe as a wallflower. Someone who, when other people look at him, they're saying, he doesn't have the pedigree, he doesn't have the name, he doesn't have the reputation, he's not popular, he's just there. But he also adds that he had a native, cheery temperament about himself. I think that's just wonderful to relate because this, the way Joseph Smith tells it, just relates to teenagers. They see themselves as being anxious and maybe not the most popular person. And there's some in every school who are the popular people. But they also see themselves as having happiness, that there's some places where they feel good. What I learned, that if you're a teenager or maybe a few years older, if you're feeling anxious or maybe you're not feeling like you're worth a lot, you need to know that God hears and answers every prayer. Where was Joseph Smith born? He was born December 23rd, 1805 in Sharon, Vermont. And that's a picture of Sharon, Vermont, the birthplace of Joseph Smith. There is a little stone where the original cabin once stood. It's no longer there. But it's a threshold marker, a threshold where you go into the old cabin is there at the site. You think about Joseph Smith's parents. Joseph Smith Sr., dad, was born 12th of July, 1771. Mom, who was an incredible woman, born 8th of July, 1775. And if you want a good book to read, I highly recommend her book that she wrote about Joseph, History of Joseph Smith by his mother, Lucy Mack Smith. It is one of those timeless books that will never go out of style because she sees Joseph through a mother's eye and gives insights to Joseph that we don't have anywhere else. Think about who his siblings were. Well, there were quite a few. The first baby was unnamed and was born 1897. Alvin was the first live birth, followed by Hiram, older sister, Sophronia, Joseph, and then younger brother and sisters Samuel, Ephraim, who lived a short time, William, Catherine, Don Carlos, and last but not least, Lucy. Were they stable? Now, that is a story in and of itself. And that starts, if you want to have great history on this, go to Saints, great book, pages 3 to 5, and it's going to tell you the story about Mount Tabora, which led to what they called the summer that really was not a summer. It was really the year without a summer, where crops in July froze because of the ash that Mount Tabora threw up into the air. It forced Joseph Smith Sr. to move to Palmyra, New York. We're fast-forwarding quite a ways. It's estimated that he had about 100 acres. And if I can get my mouse just working here and bring it over, okay, there it is. You'll see right here is the log home. Now, they're going to be building a frame home with Alvin right here, and Alvin is working on it. But at the time, they're in this log home. Now, some of the other things that we're going to look at is, they have a barn and a cooper shop over here. And as you're going, now this way's north, but as you go across the bridge, this area right here is a Sacred Grove area. An aerial view would be here. You'd have the family farm right here. Okay, so this would be the frame house. And here's the path that we were looking at. And this would be the Sacred Grove area. And as a side note, This, you can see it because I got this from Google Maps, is a Palmyra, New York temple. And one of the wonderful things about this temple is it is the only temple that has clear glass window that looks out of the temple. Because most temples you go into, and it's this beautiful stained glass. But there, it has a clear window, so the temple right here can look out really from a celestial view here to a hallowed place here. You can see out that window the sacred grove. Just kind of a cool random fact. So you go to what we call the restoration cabin. It looks a lot like the cabin that they have. It's not big. And if you've ever gone there, it's just really kind of fun to see. And the kids would sleep upstairs. There's a nice loft, and we'll get into that probably with the next week's video. And here's a kind of reconstruction. You have the log home right in behind, and you have the cooper shop and the barn. When Joseph Smith is growing up at about age 12, he starts to really wondering about religion, about his state with God, about his anxiety for his sins. Dr. Milton Bachman said, "The great apex of religious fervor occurred between 1816 and 1821, when revivals were reported in more towns and a greater number of settlers joined churches than in any other previous period in New York history. Camp meetings were usually held on the edge of a small grove of trees, or in a small clearing in the midst of a forest. After traveling many miles, the settlers would locate their wagons and pitch their tents on the outskirts of the encampment. Farmers' markets and grog or liquor shops often sprung up near the campgrounds, thereby providing some farmers with unusual economic opportunities. The meetings continued for several days. Minister would rotate preaching assignments so that one minister would immediately follow another, and at times 2 or 3 ministers would preach simultaneously in different parts of the camp. Ministers not only preached lengthy sermons, but devoted much of their time in counseling and directing prayer circles and group singing." So in 1820, you have only about 7% of the population in the church on a given Sunday. One of the reasons why is there's been a mass migration. And at this time, you really have a lot of these people who are going out trying to find out where their people have gone and trying to get them into their congregations, trying to get the converts as well. For Joseph Smith, he follows a simple pattern that we try and teach in seminary. We call it the ask or the acquiring spiritual knowledge, where you act in faith. You have a question, and a question's good. You have to act in faith. And as you're looking for an answer for questions, you examine concepts and your questions with an eternal perspective, and you seek further understanding through divinely appointed sources. And you think about how Joseph Smith followed that pattern. He acts in faith. He attends different religious meetings. He is searching for which church to join. He is seeking from divinely appointed sources. That's, I think, why James 1:5 just strikes him so much. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally, abundantly, upbraideth, doesn't chastise you for asking him questions, upbraideth not, and it shall be given to him. I love Elder McConkey's quote about that one verse. This single verse of Scripture has had a greater impact and a more far-reaching effect upon mankind than any other single sentence ever recorded by any prophet in any age. James 1:5 may have been given to him by a preacher, a Methodist preacher, and he does take it to heart, but he's reflecting on it time and time again as he goes into the woods. He has that pattern and follows it and just says, I have learned for myself. And I would encourage you, and I'm just pausing right here, the church has produced a wonderful video. I would highly recommend that you show it in your home. If you're in a classroom, this is one of those videos that's kind of one of those must-see. And, you can see it there. I'll have it in my notes. Or you can just go to the church's website. It's called Ask of God, Joseph Smith's First Vision. What this does is it takes facts that we learn from different accounts that Joseph Smith gave during his lifetime. It is wonderful that we have different accounts from Joseph Smith. Now, there's quite a few. There's an 1832, 35, and 39, all of which Joseph, the first one, he in part wrote, written by Joseph, and he had a scribe, Frederick Williams. The 1835 and 39 were written by different people, but he was there. One of them was given to Joshua, the traveling minister. The 1839 is the official account, the one that we have in the Pearl of Great Price. The other ones, the 40, 42, 43, 44, and 50, are published or written by other people from their recollection of what Joseph wrote. The 42 account was written to a newspaper editor, Mr. Wentworth. And each of these different accounts are in some ways a little bit like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They give a storyline that's very, very similar. Each of them adds a few details. Sometimes there's things that don't seem quite right. And some critics of the church, or critics of Joseph Smith, point out that he's not always consistent with the way he says things as proof that, say, maybe he's not telling the truth. But the better historians, or I think maybe just let Stephen Prothero, he is a historian professional, and he says it this way: critics of Mormonism have delighted in the discrepancies between this canonical account and earlier renditions, especially one written in Joseph Smith's own hand in 1832. Such complaints, however, are much ado about relatively nothing. Any good lawyer or historian would expect to find contradictions or competing narratives written down years apart and decades after the event. And despite the contradictions, key elements abide. So I'm going to come and point out some of the details in these four key renders that Joseph Smith authored himself, different accounts, and just kind of tell you some of the details that are added. Now, the 1832 account was in part written by Joseph Smith. There are some editions that are not. Let me tell you, this is Joseph Smith's. If you can see my cursor, that is his handwriting right there. And right above here, that's put in the 16th year of my age, that is not. That's his scribe. Different handwriting there. So, I don't know, a half-ish is written by Joseph, half not. His handwriting, in the 1832 account, he's struggling to find, I think, his way to describe things. Let me give you an example. When he tries to describe God appearing, he says it's a pillar of fire, and I circled it because he scratches it out. And right next to it, he scratches light. In all these accounts, some of them are fire and some of these are light. He struggles to describe how to describe God when he comes down and visits him. In that same year, 1832, he wrote a friend that he felt imprisoned, quote, by paper, pen, and ink, and a crooked, broken, scattered, and imperfect language. He called the written word a narrow little prison. So in that I'm going to go back a slide, 1832 account, he does have where he describes God coming down. And as he does that, he's describing, he says the Spirit was over him, the Lord parted the heavens, and the Lord appeared. He uses sometimes similar words, and it can be interpreted as God the Father and the Son, or some people have said, interpreted it's the same person. Doesn't quite make all the way the same sense if it's one person, but he's not consistent with the way he uses it, and sometimes critics don't like that. But the 1835 account is from his journal, and he's giving it to Robert Matthias. He's introduced as Joshua, the Jewish minister, but his name was Robert Matthias, and he gives an account of his first vision to him. And in it, it's a little bit more personal. It's kind of off it's contemporary. I don't know the words, and I've got this all on film. Spur of the moment. And he's just telling him a little bit more emphasis on that this is the account where he mentions that he was filled with the Spirit and he saw angels there, angels in the grove. He also describes how he just felt like, and he did this in other versions as well, that because the brightness, the intensity of the light surrounding God the Father and Jesus Christ, he felt like the entire forest would be consumed. And he's a little bit surprised that it wasn't. So the 1835, I'm just going to read you a little bit of a sentence here, a pillar of fire down to here. It says, here's what he wrote: a pillar of fire appeared above my head. It presently rested down upon me, or my head, because he has some things scratched out there, and filled me with joy unspeakable. A personage appeared in the midst of this pillar of flame, which was spread all around, and yet nothing consumed. Another personage soon appeared like unto the first, and he said unto me, thy sins are forgiven thee. He testified to me that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and I saw many angels in this vision. It's a great vision to be able to read, to see those little extra details that he shares with our Jewish minister Joshua, or Robert Matthias. 1839, 38, 39 account. I don't know which way you want to put it. I'm going to put it 39. He starts it in 38. He begins dictating this to George Robinson, April 17th, 38. But then shortly after that, he is taken to Liberty Jail. And after he comes back from Liberty Jail, he dictates this, he resumes it, to James Mulholland on the 11th of June. So we're now over a year later. And this is what's included in the Pearl of Great Price. The 1842 account is a letter to Mr. John Wentworth, editor of the Chicago Democrat. It's much more kind of straight, I'm going to give this to you, here's the facts, here's what happened kind of a approach. All of these accounts have the same reoccurring theme. Joseph had a question. It is questions that fuel our restoration as he goes into the woods to ask them. God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared unto him. I love the way the saint summarizes all this. After he has the vision, he goes to tell people. And here's kind of that summary. At first, the preacher he goes to tell, treated his words lightly. People claimed to have heavenly visions from time to time. But then he became angry and defensive. He told Joseph his story was from the devil. The days of visions and revelations had ceased long ago, he said, and they would never return. Joseph was surprised and soon found that no one would believe his vision. Why would they? He's only 14 years old and practically had no education. He came from a poor family, expected to spend the rest of his life working the land and doing odd jobs to earn a meager living. And yet his testimony bothered some people enough to ridicule him. How strange, he thought, a simple boy of no consequence in the world could attract such bitterness and scorn. Why persecute me for telling the truth? He wanted to ask. Why does the world think to make me deny what I've actually seen? Joseph puzzled over these questions for the rest of his life. I had actually seen a light. In the midst of that light, I had saw two personages, and they did, in reality, speak to me, he later recounted. And though I was hated and persecuted for saying that I'd seen a vision, yet it was true. I knew it, and that I knew that God knew it, he testified, and I could not deny it. You know what? And I know that too. Now, in my notes, I'm going to put some references. If it's helpful, you can click on these hyperlinks for, especially like Joseph Smith papers, tell you a little bit more about Mount Tabor, or history of the saints, and there's some link to the video, and some thoughts on maybe how that may be good for teaching in a home or in a family or in a classroom. Just to testify, God answers anxious teenagers' prayers, and our prayers too. And asking sincere questions to God is a great thing to do. It's wonderful to have multiple accounts of the first vision. They add a little bit more details and help us understand the first vision a little bit better. And I'd encourage you, wherever you are, to watch that video that the church has produced, Ask of God, Joseph Smith's first vision. And I just leave you that little witness that I know that Joseph Smith has seen God the Father and Jesus Christ. Thank you for spending a little bit of time with me today as we study Joseph Smith history, 1 through 16. I hope you have a lovely day. Keep smiling. Bye.